Hi, everybody, and good afternoon from Jerusalem. Welcome to the annual JPPI webinar on the occasion of the publication of the report, The Jewish World Dialogue. My name's Nadia Beider, and I'll be moderating this event. I would like to mention that we are going to have a discussion, and then at the end, we'll have time for questions. So please put any questions in the chat, and then I'll be able to read them out. The Jewish World Dialogue is one of the Jewish People Policy Institute's flagship initiatives and is now in its 10th year. It provides a context for convening Jewish leadership groups throughout the Jewish world to solicit their views on challenging issues. The 2023 dialogue examined the growing polarization and uncivil discourse within Israel and Jewish communities worldwide, especially with regard to Israeli government policies affecting religious pluralism in Israel and vis-a-vis the administered or occupied territories or Judea and Samaria, whatever you want to call it. In the case of this year's dialogue, the planning, convening, and even the writing of the report all took place before the horrific events of October 7th, Simchat Torah. Hence, reading our report today appears, even to us, as if it is from a prior era, as it focuses on an issue that was previously seen as critical, a growing polarization in the organized Jewish world, particularly over Israeli governmental policies vis-a-vis religious pluralism and the administration of the territories and occupied areas. But we still think it's worth looking at the findings of the report, and we can also consider them in a post 7th of October context. So I would like to call on Professor Yedidia Stern, the president of the JPPI, for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. About 3.5 years ago, when I came to JPPI, we started strategic planning for the Institute. What should we deal with? And the end of it was, the end result was that we would like to deal with the issue of cohesiveness of the Jewish people. We identified the challenge in 3 different arenas: in the diaspora, among diaspora Jews, in Israel, among Israelis, and in between Jews in the diaspora and Jews in Israel. In each one of these arenas, we find a real challenge of the lack of cohesion and the need to intervene and to help out. Now, if I have to make a very simple statement, I would say that the lack of cohesion has to do with the fact that we do not share the same vision about what does it really mean to be a Jew in our days. Some of us tend to be liberals with a universal approach to Judaism, and some of us tend to be more conservative, more particularistic in the sense of religious understanding of Judaism or national understanding of Judaism. As we all know, in North America, the majority of the Jews tend to be on the liberal side. In Israel, the majority of Jews tend to be the more particularistic, nationalistic, religious side. And because of these different characteristics, the 2 major congregations, we have a tension between Jews in Israel and outside of Israel. Now, when we started 3.5 years ago, we didn't know what will happen. And in the last 1.5 years, obviously, we were all kidnapped into a journey which wasn't such a nice journey. We had in Israel the judicial reform, and later on the war that we are experiencing right now. It's a big question whether these 2 things are going to enhance cohesiveness within us in each of these arenas, or maybe just the opposite. And when you add to it the anti-Semitism, the outbreak of anti-Semitism that we're experiencing, which is unprecedented, obviously, from the Shoah till today, again, we ask ourselves, is it going to help us in being again one people, or is it going to tear us apart even more? What I would like to do is to use the terms of Rabbi Soloveitchik from the 60s, when he said, even if we do not share the covenant of destiny, and we definitely do not share it, maybe we should share the covenant of faith. And I think that when we face the threats from outside, in Israel, in terms of the war, and outside of Israel, in terms of the anti-Semitism, it's a call of our common faith to try to behave as one cohesive people, even if we do not agree about the end goals of the journey. So you'll hear a lot about it, mainly on the American side of it, but obviously we will not be able to limit the discussion just to this. We'll talk about the whole aspect, the whole spectrum of things. So again, thank you everybody for joining. I want to thank deeply to Dr. John Ruskay and Dr. Shlomo Fischer. Both are the authors of the dialogue today, and both are senior fellows at JPPI. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yedidia. So now we're going to be calling on presenters of the report who did all this research on the Dialogue Project, Dr. Shlomo Fischer, Senior Fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, and Dr. John Ruskay, who aside from being a Senior Fellow at the JPPI, was also the CEO of the New York Jewish Federation for around 15 years. Shlomo, I think you're muted.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to get right into it. We conducted the dialogue sessions. We talked about 13 sessions. We conducted 13 sessions with 247 participants, mainly in North America, but also in South Africa and with the German Jewish leadership as well. So we had some representation from outside. The 247 participants that we had were, as a rule, older than other dialogue in other dialogue sessions. 70% were over 46. They were more Jewishly engaged. We had a large plurality that had been in Israel over 10 times. And some of their other characteristics were reflected their age, such as their membership in the conservative religious movement in the United States. So I'm now going to move over to a shared screen PowerPoint. I'm going to try and pull this off. Technology is always challenging. And why don't I see this? Here we go. Share. Okay. So, all right. So, doesn't seem to do what it should do. Okay. Anyway, so we asked, so did this group experience polarization? And indeed, it has. Over 97% have stated that they believe that conversations and discussions, especially about these topics, have become more polarized. By more polarized, what emerged over the course of the sessions was that when people said more polarized, what they meant was that it affected their social relations. What they meant was that certain people stopped talking to relatives and friends, or at least they stopped talking about certain topics with relatives and friends. In other words, that disagreement had impinged upon relations within the family, between friends, between congregants and colleagues, and that's what they meant. So 97% said that had occurred, and if to the extent of what this polarization meant, so first of all, so they did say that, as Nadia indicated in her introduction, that the discussions about Israel were especially polarizing. 73% said that discussions about Israel are more polarizing in the Jewish community than discussions about other topics. And to get the sense of how severe this polarization was 59% basically said that it would impede the ability of the Jewish people to come together in an effective fashion when the state of Israel and or Jewish communities are threatened. Again, this is before the current events. This is before the events on campus. This is before all of that. But these people believed that, they said that the polarization was so severe that it would affect the practical or pragmatic functioning of Jewish leadership in order to deal with imminent threats and imminent things. So that's okay. So if we ask ourselves what lies behind this polarization, we can get a hint from the following finding, which was that when we asked the participants about what was most difficult about these conversations, about these polarizing, so a plurality, 40% answered that people increasingly assert that those with whom they differ are traitors, disloyal, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, etc. And this repeated itself. This finding repeated itself in almost every session. And what that means to us is that people use these discussions to structure Jewish identity, and that they set up boundaries of Jewish identity: what's legitimately Jewish, what's authentically Jewish, and whose opinions and what opinions are outside the pale. So so we have here these difficult discussions were in fact seem to us to be attempts or to involve construction of the boundaries of legitimate Jewish collective identity, and to signal what's legitimate and what's not legitimate, Jewishly legitimate or not. So that seemed to us to signal a much deeper process, which we think requires further investigation, we think is very important, and that's the disaggregation of Jewish collective identity. And that's based on a model in which Jewish collective identity basically has, in the last, since the Second World War, we'll put it that way, has three dimensions, has an ethno-national dimension, right? The ethnic dimension, the Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, the national dimension, of course, in the state of Israel. There's a sacred religious dimension, and there's a universalist ethical dimension. Now, right after World War II, and until around the year 2000, it was conceived that these dimensions really went together, that you could be very pro-Israel, you could be very universalist or liberal in your politics, and that these all had sacred or religious dimensions. What we seem to be witnessing is a disaggregation of these dimensions, such that you have, on the one hand, a coming together, let's say, on the right, of the ethno-national and the sacred religious, and that would be reflected in the current government in Israel, but also be reflected in the more orthodox and conservative sections of the diaspora, conservative small c, Shamranim, in the more orthodox and right-wing sections of the Jewish population in the diaspora. And on the other side, you have an opposite construction of a universalist ethical dimension, right? That, in other words, when we mean universalist ethical, we mean defense of minorities, defense of human rights. The Jews, of course, have developed over the years a sensitivity to these issues as a minority. So you have that coming together with some sort of sacred or religious dimensions. You have either a large emphasis on the right on the ethno-national, you have a mirror emphasis on the left of the universalist ethical. So whereas once upon a time you had all three dimensions coming together, today you're seeing more and more of a polarization, which is about, as Yedidia mentioned, the dimensions and the nature of Jewish identity. So I'm going to leave the analysis at that, and I'm going to turn the discussion over to my colleague, John Ruskay, who will outline what he thinks, or what we learned, what can be done about this situation. Thank you very much. Nadia.
Hi.
John.
John, can you hear us? Okay, just hang on a second. He was here a minute ago. It seems like he's got an issue with his.
I'm going to end the stop share.
Okay. It's possible that John is having some kind of internet issue. Oh no, he's connecting now. Okay, so he'll be with us in a second. Just let him. Okay, fine. John, would you like to present your side of the findings now?
Right. Once, let me see if I'm on. Whoop, there we are. I had to get off to correct the Zoom issue, so I think my dear colleague Shlomo Fischer got through the report. I'm here to really present the recommendations, which, and I want to move forward. We've got some terrific respondents, so I'll discuss them briefly. Good afternoon, in Israel. Number one, this issue, which Dr. Fischer spoke about the disaggregation of collective Jewish identity, we believe is a critically important issue. And we strongly recommend that foundations and federations, which tend to be resistant to investing in research generally and Jewish identity research, this deserves serious focus, because we think it will have important implications. And the more we can understand it, the better we can understand it, the more potential steps could be taken to limit it. So number one, investing in research, unusual for not so common in Jewish life, on this issue. Number two, and really number three, which is really about a substantial, massive increase in Israel education. We've discussed this previously. The conflation of Israel education and Israel advocacy has meant, in our view, a lack of focus on Israel education. Israel advocacy is critical, mobilizing the community to stand with the people of Israel for all the reasons. Critical, has been, will, is right now. But we also believe that Israel education, which does many things, connects people with their understanding, deepens their understanding of the history, of our people's connection to the land, the emergence of Zionism, the incredible what has been done, etc., also introduces people to the broad range of Zionist thinkers, past and present, to help people understand there is a range of views which are considered within the Zionist world. And that is woefully, in our view, has been not sufficient. And so we think a massive investment, which would require focusing on helping develop personnel, teachers, principals, etc., capable of doing this, curriculum for all stages of learning will be needed. Three, throughout the dialogues, and I want to mention, maybe I missed it, but the dialogues were both quantitative. Everyone who participated filled out a questionnaire, which is how, that's the quantitative, how Dr. Fischer reported on the percentage results of different things, and qualitative. In each, we had breakout groups, small groups, etc., for discussion. In so many of them, people spoke about what they felt to be the arbitrary ways in which many communal institutions include or exclude groups from participating in Jewish communal events. And we recommend that it is time for federations, maybe the Conference of Presidents, to become explicit. Those that have certain views can participate. We put up as a trial balloon that all who affirm explicitly and publicly the right of the Jewish people to sovereignty in our ancient homeland can legitimately participate in Jewish communal events, whether sponsored by the conference, sponsored by Jewish organizations, sponsored by federations. Four, we note that often, and many of the participants in these dialogues spoke about the fact that when Israeli political leaders use such terms as anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, self-hating, they're poisonous, they're traitors, this is terrible, very negative, has huge negative consequences, and we really want to encourage Israeli political leadership to be more mindful and aware of that before they use such terms that may be the modus operandi of Israeli politics, deleterious in our North American Jewish communities. And finally, in the area of lay leadership training, when I became involved with federations, and leadership education was often about how to volunteer leaders should become more effective in advocating and raising funds, soliciting, etc. We think now leadership education in federations and Jewish communal institutions ought consciously focus on how helping people spend time with, listen to, interact with people who have views that is significantly different from their own. This is obviously, as we note in the report, a problem of the broader culture. Polarization has increased in multiple ways. But within the Jewish community, and particularly on issues related to Israel, we think it would be really important for Jewish institutions to find ways, and we suggest of some of the methods that can be used. And by the way, many of the participants cited small efforts that were undertaken in their federations to bring people together with divergent views, to let them listen to, interact with, discuss civilly. So these are the 5 recommendations that we set forth. Some of the respondents may have other views. That's the recommendations at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. It's given us all food for thought. As John said, we're lucky enough to have some of the leading figures of representing Jewry around the world who can offer a response to this report. And so I'd like to call upon Rabbi Eliott Cosgrove. He is the rabbi of one of the leading conservative synagogues, the Park Avenue Synagogue. I'd like to ask you, Eliott, to respond.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Dr. Beider, thank you. To my teachers, Dr. Fischer, Dr. Ruskay, and Dr. Stern, thank you. And it's great to be part of this discussion. And whenever I am on a panel with Erika Rudin-Luria, I feel like I've made it in the Jewish world. So it's really great to reconnect with an old friend. Thank you for letting me be part of this. I want to respond both as an observer of American Jewry, a rabbinic congregational rabbi, but also as a pastoral presence. Because I think at the heart of this study is trauma. And in that sense, whereas the work of this study long preceded the events of October 7th, I actually would suggest to the leadership here that it's even more important, and I'll get to that in the very concluding words that I'm about to share. As a congregational rabbi, I work with people who have experienced loss and trauma all the time. And there are a million responses, but at large baskets that I can put people in response to their trauma. There are some people who respond to hurt, loss, grief by saying, I have experienced hurt, loss, and grief, and therefore I am going to be responding with empathy that no one should experience that which I experienced in my lifetime. And they are driven by kindness. I think of Holocaust survivors who think of a kindness that was extended to them, and that's their focus, not on the horror and the loss of their personal experience or their family's experience. The other response to trauma is anger, vigilance, and sometimes vengeance. They say, I have experienced this trauma, and therefore I want to make sure that it never again happens to me, and the shields go up, and the defenses are there, and we are sometimes vigilant and sometimes vengeful. So my contention, Dr. Fischer, would be that this is not a post-World War II phenomena, that somehow 2 Judaisms have emerged, one that is particular and nationalistic, and the other is universal and liberal. But I would say that these 2 strains are indigenous, authentic, and part of the Jewish condition from the very beginning. We just finished Passover. Half of the world reads the Passover Haggadah as a tale of Gerim Hayitem. You were once strangers in a strange land, and therefore well, you are concerned not only with Russian Jewry, Ethiopian Jewry, or Syrian Jewry, and all the extra matzahs we used to put in our Seder table, but we also put an orange at the Seder table. We think of the LGBT community. We think of all of those who are alienated on the peripheral, the margins of society, who are seeking liberation. That is the one way to tell the Seder. Another way to tell the Haggadah is to say, the Hisha Amda, that every generation a new Pharaoh arises to destroy us, and therefore, and when we open up the door for Elijah, we say Shvo Chamatcha al Hagoyim, that we are pouring out our wrath on the nations. Both tellings of the Haggadah are authentic tellings of the Jewish story. Both come from a historic oppression. The question is, are we going to respond by way of empathy, or are we going and concern universal for the other, or are we going to respond by way of vigilance and distrust? This is also the story of Purim, that we say, is it a tale of light and gladness and joy, or a simcha v'sason bikar, or is it chapter 9 where vengeance is taken out by our would-be destroyers? And this double helix of the Jewish DNA has been there from the very get-go. And you can talk about the Kishinev pogroms that gave rise to Bialik's Ir HaHariga, which ultimately was the poem that arguably mobilized Zionism, that Jews needed a home by which they could have safety and self-determination. You could look at the Tel Chai massacre that gave rise to Jabotinsky and the Iron Wall. You can look at 73, that both on the one hand gave rise, the Yom Kippur War, to the settlement movement. I know it started after 67, but really took shape at that moment, or the peace movement. They all flourished in the wake of that. So I don't think it's as simple as saying that American Jewry is of a universal liberal, ethical bent, and Israel is particular and nationalistic. I think there's elements of both these communities in both locales that have been there all the way through, and we see it from the most benign expressions, right? Where the day after Yom HaShoah, why exactly is someone putting an Israeli flag over their shoulders when they're walking through Auschwitz-Birkenau? Because and the F-16s flying overhead. Why? Because the response to trauma is a ethno-national response, and we might say, well, that's very nice that the Israeli or American kids go on March and the Living, and that's how they respond. But there's also, of course, Kahanist and other radical responses to Jewish fears and vulnerability. And I think of that famous Yehuda Elkanah quotation that from Auschwitz came two peoples, a minority that proclaims this will never happen again, and a sacred and anxious majority who proclaims that this will never happen to us again. And we have these two peoples that have been there from the beginning and all the way through Auschwitz, 73, and then, of course, which brings us to today. To Dr. Ruskay, I agree in my entirety with your recommendations that the importance of Israel education, the importance of separating Israel education from Israel advocacy. I think it's very important also to allow for these voices to exist side by side. I think it is far easier to call someone a colonial oppressor or a self-hating Zionist than it is to actually dignify someone else's views as an authentic expression of the diversity and of Jewish peoplehood from the very beginning. We would rather call someone else disloyal, inauthentic, or otherwise than actually, deal with the fact, the hard questions we need to. I think we need to learn to sit on our hands. As a parent, I've discovered that the most difficult thing to do when we see our children doing something we don't approve of is to sit on our hands. And I think that a strong center needs to emerge that is one that is able to countenance views that make us uncomfortable and that are not our own. And of course, there's a problem because, that center is oftentimes shouted down by those at the polar extremes, those who are carrying the megaphones. And I never thought it would be courageous to be a centrist. But I think this is an hour that demands courage, and the philanthropic and institutional community needs to champion those, set ground rules for those who are engaged in these acts of dialogue, and throw a flag on the field and say certain things are beyond the pale of what Jewish communal discourse and funding will permit. And then, of course, and I'll end with this moment. I have no one's, the days of prophecy are over, but the Jewish people have just experienced and are in the midst of experiencing a terrible trauma. And I have every reason to believe that the Jewish people will respond in exactly the same way they have responded from the beginning. There will be those who will be responding to October 7th with increased vigilance, vengeance, and extremism. And there will be those who will turn to universalism, empathy, and I think we need to figure out a way, which is very much the work of JPPI, that those voices can sit at the table together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Cosgrove, for sharing your insights with us and really bringing the focus back to the relevance today. I'd now like to invite Erika Rudin-Luria, who is the CEO of the Cleveland Jewish Federation and herself a past participant in the Dialogue Project, to give her thoughts. I just want to add also that the Cleveland Jewish Federation has been a star participant in the Dialogue Project over the years. We appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beider, my teacher, Dr. John Ruskay, Dr. Fischer, and it's always hard to follow my friend, Rabbi Eliott Cosgrove, and I want to thank Yedidia and JPPI as well. So from a community perspective, how is this manifesting itself? A few comments. First, it was fascinating to look at the language, and I read the comments from the dialogue, looking at it with today's post-October 7th eyes. I think we did create a false binary for people that if you love Israel, you have to love all of Israel, and that we didn't pull apart the government, the state, the land, and the people. During the judicial reform process, we tried to re-articulate this to people, to pull those pieces apart and to say to people that when you love something, actually, you dig in, you don't walk away. Those that walked away from everything, though, largely, whereas the protesters in Israel very much wrapped themselves in Ahavat Yisrael, wrapped themselves in the flag very much. In terms of whether the large outbreak of anti-Semitism today will or won't pull us apart, a few thoughts based on what we're seeing and what was in the dialogue. First, I think that as political and denominational lines have been drawn in like black permanent Sharpie marker, it's allowed for demonization. And we saw that in the comments, actually, from the dialogue participants, that the politics and disinformation, as it grows more toxic, people disappeared into their own echo chambers. And it did impinge on social and familial relationships. And it put Israel in the context of winners and losers. One of the different points that I wonder if we would find if we were to do this dialogue today, in the study, it showed that people are finding parallels, the left in the United States seeing parallels with the left in Israel. I know that I've had many people comment to me in Jewish Cleveland that they're talking to family and friends in Israel, and they're hearing things from them that they had never heard before. They're hearing that they care more or care less about different groups, that they support war efforts more or less than they had in the past, and that these don't necessarily line up. And I think it's really because of what Rabbi Cosgrove was talking about and the level of trauma that people are in, and frankly, the level of isolation. I've been struck during the past few months when I've been in Israel of the dissonance between what is being discussed and what's known on the ground in Israel versus what's in the media and what's being discussed in the United States. Even though they both look to be about October 7 and the war and the hostages, they're actually very different conversations that don't actually even always sound like we're on the same planet. So with the current toxic anti-Semitic protests on college campuses, we've also seen that media have loved to focus on the Jews involved in those protests and focused on the Jews that are yelling the same genocidal chants as the others are. This compounds that trauma, and I think is deeply, deeply painful for anyone that I have spoken to in the American Jewish or Israeli community. And while most of these Jews may not pass the test of the recommendation that John and Shlomo put forth, recognizing the right of Jewish people to the sovereignty, it's still deeply, deeply painful because we want people to count themselves in with us. And I would go as so far to wonder, and this maybe is a point for research in the future, if we've internalized this, I think all of us have had that experience when something bad happens anywhere in the world, and it's a Jew who does it, or an Israeli who does it, or something that Israel does. We feel great pain, and if it's something we disagree with, we feel pain and we feel disgusted and we're embarrassed and we hurt more deeply. We actually apply, I'd say, a higher standard to ourselves and to Israel, and to Jews. The same thing, actually, we criticize others of doing to us. And while we talk about responsibility to each other, normally in terms of Kol Yisrael, Arvim Zeh B'Zeh, and our responsibility to care for each other, I'd suggest that we sometimes act as if we're actually responsible for each other's actions. And we shoulder the blame and we shoulder collective responsibility. Again, the same collective responsibility that we would not want others to put on us, we place on ourselves. So I wonder and would hypothesize that maybe we've internalized that notion of collective responsibility to the point that it adds to our dislike and sometimes demonization of the other Jew, making it possible for people to sometimes identify more with the person who's not Jewish, who they may not actually have much in common with, because it is so painful, the idea of being similar in that way to a Jew that you disagree with in a way that feels so fundamentally. So we're drawing and redrawing lines right now, trying to show openness, and particularly now with the college students, trying to say to them, look, you don't need to side with the haters. We also care. You're also part of this larger tent with us. I'll just comment that the other data point that I wonder if it would be different is around the 59% of the diaspora Jews who thought that we would not be able to come together to confront a crisis or urgent phenomenon. I think we've seen that in the post-October 7th world, that there are actually people that are far more interested in Israel and engaging than we have. People that will say, I was never interested before, but now I realize I must get involved. I must understand. I must learn more. So with that, I very much agree with the recommendations that John put forward. I would suggest that in the expansion of Israel studies, that we make sure it's not only academic, that it includes and requires relationship with Israel, that it requires knowledge of and teaching of Hebrew and travel. It's got to be personal. So even if we're not talking about advocacy, we need to recognize that most of the information coming at people today about Israel is largely emotional. And we always want to be logical and like fact-based. And again, we're not necessarily then meeting the needs of those that we're wanting to educate. The sharing encounters, I'd say actually pushing depth of leadership or depth of relationship and real relationships, and nurturing and promoting a culture of peoplehood is something that we take very seriously in Cleveland. We speak in we all the time. And as you get involved with us and move up our leadership ranks, we continue it. I'd also just say that on the leadership training and development, we've made serious investments in Cleveland in our intermarried populations and our ultra-Orthodox. And it's not by accident that our leadership are people who care about all Jews, whether or not they count themselves in with us. And just to end, I mean, I'd say we need to promote and elevate those values within leadership. And remember that we're an eternal people. The Jewish enterprise only works if we're in this and working together.
Thank you so much for sharing your analysis with us. It's really a different way of looking at why we think and feel the way we do. Before I call on our final respondent, I just want to point out that you can start putting your questions in the Q&A. You can see the button at the bottom of your screen there. I'd now like to invite Efrat Shapira Rosenberg, a lawyer and the chair of Cohesion, the Religious Women's Forum, to share her thoughts.
Okay, so good afternoon. I don't know if I'm the only one from Israel, so I want to say good afternoon from Israel, but I don't know. I don't exactly know who I'm talking to geographically. So am I the only one from Israel, except for Yedidia?
No.
No. Okay, great. Okay, so I have to say that reading the report and also listening to everything that was really, really interesting for me to listen to, I couldn't help but think that how relevant is the report, after October 7th from an Israeli perspective. It was very hard to read it and to think, to go back to that, I don't know, world that was before, or the era even that was before October 7th. So everything that I'm going to say is taking that into consideration. I can't really say, okay, this happened, but let's talk about the report everything that happened pre-October 7th. And I want to tap into what Yedidia wrote in the opening remarks about the 3 points that are affecting this issue. It's universal trends, the policy of Israeli government, and really the deep meaning of Jewish identity in the diaspora. Those are, if I understood correctly, those are like the 3 points or 3 perspectives or 3 lenses through which this whole topic is looked through. And I think October 7th really proved that these 3 lenses are still relevant. But in a sense, I feel like number 2 and number 3 combined into one, meaning that the whole issue of Israel and the criticism that we may and may not have towards Israel, how does that affect the motivation or the content of being, of the expression Jewish identity? I think from my perspective and from my Israeli perspective, and for many Israelis that I speak to that are in the world of Jewish peoplehood and that have been connecting to this issue for many, many years, I think something radically changed. And I think the interesting rift post October 7th is not between Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, but rather within diaspora Jews, that within themselves. I think if we would have talked before October 7th, then one of the major rifts was between Israel and the diaspora, or most Israeli Jews, and what they think about Jews around the world. I'm not sure that's the issue anymore for two reasons. First of all, I think that these two communities are dealing with different challenges. I think the challenges Israel have today are existential on so many levels, and we just have so many tzarot on our heads, and the Jewish community around the world is dealing with different challenges, very deep, very disturbing challenges, but they're different. They're different. And I think, you must know much more than I do, but I think listening or watching the protests and the chants, and I think one of you called them, anti-Semitic, genocidal chants against Jews. They're not against Israelis. They don't necessarily have a lot to do. The rhetoric is maybe against Israel, but, gas the Jews, or, looking for Jews and not necessarily for Israelis, means that it's not only Israel, like we thought for the past few decades, or like 2 last decades. I think it was basically if you're pro-Israel or against Israel, and can you be pro-Israel but against Israeli government or against Israeli policy? And I think what happened post-October 7th, to me at least, proves that that's not the issue anymore. We're not talking about Israel or Israeli policy. We're talking about good old anti-Semitism, and not the question, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? I'm talking about, the good old anti-Semitism. And I think, that the really interesting article that Franklin Foer wrote in The Atlantic about the end of the golden age of American Jews, and about the fact that anti-Semitism is coming back, leaves me with a lot of things to think about on that issue, because I think the rift is between the Jews who understand, as they say, Rabbi Cosgrove talked about Purim and Megillat Esther. So it's between the Jews who understand that אם החרש תחרישי בעת הזאת, רווח והצלה יעמוד ליהודים ממקום אחר, ואת ובית אביך תאבדו, and those who feel that if we just say the right things and think the right things, will be accepted. And from my perspective, that's what it's about. That's the rift. And those lines move in totally different places, because you can be progressive, you can be very liberal, you can be very critical of Israeli policy. But if you don't understand that when push comes to shove, and when October 7th happens, you know which side you're on, then that's where the line crosses. And I think Jewish history is full of Jews who thought that if I'll only be enough, whatever, I'll be accepted. I'll be on, the good Jew. And Jewish history proves that that never happens. The what changes, but the result never changes. If we go back to 1492, and we always talk about Spanish Inquisition, but before the Inquisition, the Jews were expelled from Spain. The let's say the Masorti Jews, those who weren't willing to convert, had to leave Spain in the Alhambra decree. And those who stayed around were the ones who got the Inquisition after so many years, because they just thought if we have to choose between Jewish tradition and Spain, we're going to choose Spain, and we choose to stay behind. And then they realized that choosing Spain wasn't good enough, because Spain didn't choose them, and they were gone into the abyss of Jewish history. And so I don't know if what I sounds maybe it's a little critical of this whole topic, and it doesn't sound as good as it should sound, and maybe it doesn't sound as good as things I would have said before October 7th, but I really feel that that's the big challenge. It's to realize that there is a common story and there is a common fate for Jews. And if you feel that you can escape that fate by being quiet or by saying the right thing, then you don't know Jewish history, or it's not important enough for you to stay as part of Jewish history. And so I want to say that more than it's important to strengthen Israel education, I think it's important to strengthen Jewish history, studying of Jewish history. I think it's important to strengthen, I think American Jews specifically, even though we're talking about the diaspora, but I think it's pretty clear that we're mainly talking about American Jews. And all of us really thought that anti-Semitism is over. It's part of the past. It's like, the end of history. So part of the end of history is the end of anti-Semitism. That's it. We're there. The Geula is here. There's no more anti-Semitism. Only there, in Eastern Europe or in the East, where they're primitive and they're not liberal, they have anti-Semitism. In Russia and in the Soviet Union and those places. We in the liberal world, we don't have anti-Semitism anymore. And I think what's going on today across America and in the liberal world in general shows us that anti-Semitism is a bacteria that's resistant to every antibiotic that's ever been tried on it. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's going anywhere. And it's very important to learn the history of anti-Semitism and the fact that it's okay to be critical of Israel and to be critical of Israeli policy, but if you think that you can, outrun your Jewish fate, then, אם אחרי שתחרישי בעת הזאת, רווח והצלה יעמוד ליהודים ממקום אחר, ואת ובית אביך תאבדו.
Okay, well, thank you for those words of wisdom and sharing an Israeli perspective. I would like to mention that the dialogue report is available on the JPPI website. You can download it if you want to read the conclusions of the study in more detail. We're going to move to some questions. I don't think I'm going to have time to read all the comments, but I'm going to start with some questions. So I have a question here from Nancy Kaufman, which really kind of relates to what we've been saying about drawing lines and things like that. So she says, the signs may have been there, but the realities on the ground have changed radically since October 7th. It's critical that the mainstream JC invest in efforts to engage young and old people who do not toe the party line support for Israel no matter what. By ignoring those voices, it will only make them stronger. So who would like to jump in on this issue of voices that should be included, ignored, where we draw these lines?
I'm happy to say something, and then I'm sure others will have more to say. So you're saying we should include the voices that are not included. I'd say that I don't think there's a party line in the way that there used to be. Or maybe it's that the party line was here and the party line has expanded to here. Now, by the way, I'll tell you, in things that we write in the Cleveland Jewish community, and my board chair, Dan Zellman, is on listening to the webinar too. I'll tell you, generally, the folks on the polar extremes will tell us that we're not talking to them and we don't speak for them. And so generally, I think there are people that feel excluded regardless of what we say. But I don't know that there's no one that's saying you must accept all and you must, and that all is perfect and we are perfection and you gotta wave the flag of we are perfect. And I'd say though that what different people want and require in terms of dialogue is different. And we're struggling with that, and we're struggling to do right by people, to have conversations. What crosses the line? Someone had said that an Israeli was not allowed to be a professional in a place. And we said, like, that crosses the line, like, once you're excluding, that goes to a level of bias that we won't support.
Anyone else like to comment on this question?
I'll just say one of the my reflections of the pre-October 7th world was that the effects of the judicial reform, killed a sacred cow of American Jewry, that American Jews could not be critical of, right, that famous Arthur Hertzberg quotation about the only thing that you can be, excommunicated from by American Jewry is criticism of Israel. You had mainstream American Jews, Federation directors, congregational rabbis, myself, speaking out against the judicial reform and against the government. And I think there was what was treif became kosher, and what was and that was a big change about the inclusiveness. Now that's totally changed post October 7th, but I think it goes to what Efrat was getting at as to, we can be expansive. We could perhaps even reflect the diversity of views within Israel as American Jews, but I think we need to know what side we're on.
Okay, I'm going to move to a question from Judy White. Isn't the split between religious Jews and secular Jews in Israel and the diaspora a primary concern? Who would like to speak to that issue, the split between religious and secular?
I'll be happy to say something about that. I think I dream of the day when we can go back to deal with this kind of issue. I think that'll be the good days when we go back to, talking about what does it mean to have a Jewish identity, being religious and being secular, and the depth of a deep secular Jewish identity. Those will be a Mot HaMashiach. I think that today we have much more existential issues to deal with, and I also think that on that topic, maybe a little bit as maybe what I'll say will come as a surprise to part of the listeners, but I think that the split between religious Jews and secular, or the conversation dealing with what does it mean, what does Jewish identity mean in Israel between secular and religious Jews, I think it can be inspiring to the dialogue between secular and religious Jews in the diaspora, and also the other way around, obviously. I think there's a very interesting conversation going on in Israel in these issues, dafka, because, being a secular Israeli, you don't really have to work on your or invest in your Jewish identity, because just by living here, you breathe Jewish air, you speak Hebrew, you have a Jewish calendar. You don't even have it almost goes without saying. It's like the air that you're breathing. And I think in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 or 5 years, secular Jews in Israel are starting to understand that that's not enough, and they have been inspired by what American Jews or diaspora Jews in general are investing in their Jewish identity. So I think, if and when Bezrat Hashem, we all overcome all of the challenges that these past 6 months, and unfortunately in the near future too, we have to overcome. I think those will be the good times, and I think if that's the main issue, there's a lot to cooperate about and a lot to learn on both sides of the ocean from what's going on here and there.
It's interesting you should say that, because there's a comment here from Barry, I can't see his surname, saying, along with expanding Israel education in diaspora, there needs to be diaspora education among Israelis, that very much mirroring this idea,
right?
And that the two sides have a lot to learn. Okay, yes.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Okay, I think that the split between the religious and the non-religious is extremely alive today. I think it does not take its classical forms in terms of Shabbat, personal status, Gerushin, the status of the chief rabbinate, non-Orthodox denominations. It takes a different form, which I think is very relevant to the way what being religious in Israel means today. And I think that to a large extent, not totally, but to a very large extent, it's at the center of the controversy about the hostages. And the split about the hostages is precisely between the religious Zionist community, which seems to be, at least its political representatives, its current political representatives, who may not really represent much of the community, but that's who's in the public eye. That's Rishimata Tzionut Datit and Otzma Yehudit are the main political forces against, or apparently publicly coming out against, a deal with the hostages. Whereas those who are demonstrating very visibly in favor of such a deal are largely, not exclusively, but largely from the so-called secular liberal public. So I think that the main issue about religious and secular is how you understand the relationship between the individual and the collective, and the individual and the state, and what are the obligations or lack of obligations of the individual to the state, or the state to the individual. And I think that because we have a Jewish state, religious and secular relations take the form of visions of citizenship, visions of the national community, and visions of that. So I'd like to put that on the table. I have to say one other thing was that, I think that the debate about the boundaries of Jewish identity have sort of shifted, and it's sort of cute that that at one time J Street was considered to be Muktzah Machmat Mius, and that, and as you see from the report, but people who are active in J Street said that they were exiled from their communities, that they feel etc. I think that the debate has shifted. It has shifted. I think there was allusions to that. Erika alluded to it. Efrat alluded to it. I think that's something important to realize. I myself would just say, as an American who's been living in Israel for 50 years, that I was, and as an academic, or I used to be an academic or something like that, I was extremely taken aback by the rhetoric, the anti-Israel rhetoric in the United States. And I was extremely taken aback by the participation of non-Zionist or anti-Zionist Jews and young Jews with that rhetoric. And I believe in a big tent. And I have, I've worked with people, with academics who have identified, they're my friends, as non-Zionists, as anti-Zionists, etc. I think that the rhetoric about genocide and stuff like that crosses lines that I find them unacceptable. I mean, so I would, in a certain sense, I would even revise what John and I wrote in the report, and that yes, maybe we can accept people who have a different vision of what Jewish life is without the Jewish state, cannot accept participation in such rhetoric of genocide and stuff like that. I think that that's a blood libel, and I can't, and I don't want to mention halachic categories that extend to people like this, but such categories do exist, and then maybe they should find expression on the Jewish communal level.
Don't give up the Jewish state, though. Keep the Jewish state in it too.
No, but I think the notion that the notion to have Jewish kids chanting that the Jewish state commits genocide turns my stomach. I mean, on the most visceral level.
Right. So this is a topic that brings about a lot of emotional responses, but I'm afraid our time is up. I'm sorry we won't be able to get to the final questions. I want to say thank you so much to Dr. Ruskay and Dr. Fischer for running this project and presenting the findings for us. And thank you so much to the respondents and to the audience. Thank you for all the comments and questions. And as we said, the report is on the JPPI website. All the best.
Thank you.